Hi, you're looking at probably one of the most famous and most recognizable prehistoric structures still existing in the world today. And that, of course, is Stonehenge in England. It's a stone circle, a bunch of rocks in a circular formation with a bunch of rocks laying on top of them. Scientists and scholars, archaeologists, everybody has been trying to discover the real meaning of Stonehenge for decades, for centuries now, and still there's a lot of questions about what it was really intended to function as. And so that's a great way of talking a little bit about the prehistoric era, which is what we're going to be doing in our world and Western Civ courses. And in real simple terms, prehistory is the time of civilization before the age of writing. Because once writing occurs, societies are able to record and write down what has happened, and we have history. And so prehistory is the period of time that predates historical records for the most part. We can argue about that more or less, but that's a pretty general way of approaching the prehistoric era. Um, and so, if we take the start of history as roughly 3000 BC, before the Common Era, before the year zero, 3000 BCE, which is 5,000 years ago. Everything before that is prehistoric. Everything after that is historic. And then further, we can kind of subdivide the prehistoric period into the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods. Paleolithic being the Old Stone Age, and then Neolithic being the New Stone Age, when new tools and metals were begun to use as tools. But the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, is really the age of primarily stone tools. Um, Now, one of the things that you should always remember is when we engage in the study of prehistory, it's really hard to be absolutely 100% certain about any of the statements or assertions that we make, since the written record isn't there. We're drawing on really sketchy, minimal resources to try and figure out the nature of the societies that existed at that time. And so, for example, if we went back to the Stonehenge monument, I mean, we've been looking at large stone, this large stone formation for centuries now, and we still don't really completely understand its purpose. And so that's one of the quandaries of studying prehistory, is that we don't have the sources, we don't really have the knowledge, and so it's really difficult to make any 100% assertions, judgments about the societies that existed in prehistory. Now, those societies were organized societies. They had means of communication, they had means of trade, they had means of raising their and raising food and surviving, and they had means of raising monumental structures like Stonehenge. And so um, you can't really you have to be really careful in your judgments about the nature of prehistoric society, Stone Age society. We're not going, you just can't say that they were barbarians, that they were uncivilized, that they were primitive. In actual fact, their societies were really well advanced. They just weren't historic societies yet. And that transformation was something that occurred over millennia, over thousands and thousands of years. Now, the last thing I want to mention about prehistoric society, we've already mentioned about the division between Paleolithic and Neolithic, and you can look up more details about some of the characteristics of each of those periods of time. But the last thing we want to mention about prehistoric society is that societies emerged across the world in the prehistoric period. Um, the societies were scattered throughout the African continent, throughout Europe, throughout Asia, throughout the Americas. And so there's only with time and the discovery of the artifacts and surviving pieces of these societies can historians and archaeologists begin to piece together what were the characteristics of each of them. And I use the word society a lot, and maybe society is really not appropriate in the prehistoric period because there often wasn't a large-scale society that survival of humanity in the prehistoric period was really based on more tribal or extended family groupings. But those are societies in their own right. And so, last thing then, so when we study the prehistory period, we should be aware of our lack of sources, lack of evidence that we can then use to draw conclusions about the peoples that lived in the prehistoric period of time. Okay, thanks. P.S. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Charlie Evans, Professor of History at the Loudoun campus of Northern Virginia Community College.